Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. Today is going to be a quick introduction for day 3 in palette week, where every single day for 7 straight days I am posting some sort of palette themed content, and I realized that I forgot to film an introduction for this video, so I'm just filming a quick introduction. I'm just going to be going through my palette collection and doing a mini declutter. This is definitely not a cutthroat declutter by any means. I don't get rid of that many palettes. I also realized as I was editing the video, I didn't go through my Pat McGrath palette collection, but I'm not getting rid of any of my Pat McGrath palettes, so it's mostly a collection video with some declutters here and there. So if you're interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love for you to consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. All right, you guys, we are gonna start with stuff that's not exciting, as in I know I'm not gonna declutter these palettes, but we're just gonna start with like the easy choices so that I can save my energy for the tough decisions towards the end. So here are all of my Odin's eye palettes, and I really don't see myself getting rid of anything except for potentially my Norns palette. So we have the Stone and Rock palette right here. I buy just about every single palette release from Odin's Eye. It's just a brand that I love. Then I have the Merry Christmas palette, as well as the Christmas Eve eyeshadow palette. Then I have the Hella original palette, as well as Halloween 2. So we have the Trick or Treat palette, and then we have the Lil Ghost eyeshadow palette. Where is my, oh, here it is. Like, here's the Jewels and Gem palette that goes alongside the Stone and Rock palette, so we'll be keeping that. My newest palettes from Odin's Eye to my collection are these ones. So we have the Earthwood eyeshadow palette, which looks like this. We have Mighty Monster, which is a really fun color story. And then we also have the Spring Dragon palette, which is more of a pastel palette. And then another collection that I have the Planet Spirit palette right here. This is a beautiful palette. I also have the Sea Talk palette right here, and then the Flora Story eyeshadow palette. So keeping all those. Then we get to my 2 oldest Odin's Eye palettes in my collection. So we have the Elva palette, which is this palette right here. This is such a beautiful palette, and I just do not get enough use out of this. This is one I am gonna be keeping, and I really, really want to roll this into a project so that I can complete this palette, No Pan Left Behind, because I think it's like, looking at it, it looks absolutely stunning. So I don't really know why I never find myself reaching for this, but for right now, this one will be staying. And that brings us to the Odin's Eye Norns palette, which I have completed No Pan Left Behind style this year. It is another really old palette to my collection, and I will say I really like this eyeshadow palette. I hope that my lighting is like okay so that you can see these palettes and they're not too washed out. Anyway, I really love this palette for, like, I love the bottom row. I also like Green Chameleon and Pink Chameleon, as well as Amber Place. But as a whole, this palette just really does not motivate or excite me to reach for it. I don't love the color story, and I honestly feel like the color story kind of makes me like back away from reaching into it, even for like these few shades. So I think what I'm actually going to do is I think I'm actually going to depot these into magnetic pans and just make single shadows out of the shadows in this palette that I really enjoy. And I think I actually might declutter this palette. I think I'm ready to say goodbye to this one. As I said, I did complete it No Pan Left Behind style. I created some looks that I really did love, but I think I'm ready to part ways with this one. I do, as I said, collect most Odin's Eye palettes, but also I don't want to keep things around just like to keep them around. This one isn't so nostalgic or so special to me that it's like a palette that I will retire but keeping. I do love the artwork of this one though. Ugh. But I don't need it. So I don't need to keep it for the artwork, right? I don't. Because it just takes up space in my palette. No, I'm gonna declutter it and it's gonna be fine. Okay, we have our first declutter. I'm actually surprised I'm decluttering something from Odin's Eye. I wasn't planning to do that going into this video. All right, next up I have my Rowan quads. We have the Mood Forever quad right here. Sorry, no, we have the 1111 quad right here. I will not be getting rid of any of my Rowan quads. I love these. And we have the 75 degrees, which I am currently working on in my Rolling Project 10 pan this year. So this one is also staying. And then we have the Mood Forever quad. I love these Rowan quads. I think they're absolutely beautiful, especially if you like a cream shadow. I know that these aren't going to be for everyone, but I don't even like cream shadow that much, and I love these quads. So those will all be staying. And then I will also be keeping all of my Huda Beauty larger palettes. So we have the Rose Quartz palette, which looks like this, so beautiful. Then we have the Mercury Retrograde palette, which was my first palette, my first large palette that I purchased from Huda Beauty. All right, I turned my lighting down just a little bit to see if that helps hopefully not wash things out so much. All right, then we have the Naughty Nudes, also so stunning. We have the Huda Beauty Empowered, which is a little bit different from what she's like typically come out with. I think this one is so fun as well. And then most recently she released the Pretty Grunge palette, which looks like this. Will also be keeping. I will also be keeping all of my Natasha Denona midi palettes. These truly are like a collector's mentality. Like, I will keep these even to collect. And honestly, I love the Natasha palettes because you can pop the shades out and you can mix and match and create your own midi palettes if you want as well. I've had fun doing that. So you'll see some of my Natasha palettes don't look exactly like their original, but we have the Yucca palette, which is a favorite. We also have the Glam palette, which really has become a favorite in my collection as well. Then we have the I Need a Nude eyeshadow palette. The Xenon, which is my personal least favorite, and I kind of knew that going in. I knew this wasn't necessarily like my color story, but we have Xenon. All right, next up we have the My Dream palette, which is a very, very beautiful palette. I really like this one. Then we have Zendo, which was another palette that I didn't personally love. Mine looks very different from the original, again, because of my custom, like, create your own palette. I have the Love palette, which also wasn't a favorite, and again, mine will look very different than the original Love because I've been mixing and matching. We have my first Natasha Denona midi, which is the Sunrise palette. Mine looks, again, very different. Then I have the Natasha Denona Retro palette. I have the Pastel palette. This one is such a fun color story, but I just honestly didn't end up loving this one like I thought I was going to. And then finally we have the Retro Glam palette. Again, mine looks a little bit different, but still really enjoyed this one as well. We can stick with Natasha Denona here. I will also be keeping all of my large Natasha palettes. So I have the gold, which we all know is an absolute favorite in my collection. I have the Natasha Denona Lila palette, which this one is going in my project These Products Will Self-Destruct, but if I end up like saying goodbye to this one or decluttering it, I will just retire this and still keep it in my collection. And then finally I have the Biba palette, which is just such a great basic B sort of eyeshadow palette that I absolutely love. I will also be keeping my Ensley Rain palettes. So most recently I have the Cosmic Dreamer palette. I haven't yet gotten around to testing this, but I'm so excited to. Ensley Rain is one of my favorite indie eyeshadow brands. I have the Cold Moon palette, which is such a beautiful, cool toned color story. Then I have the Flower Moon palette, which is such a fun kind of springtime sort of color story. I love the special shimmer shades in this palette. And finally, we have the Groovy Gardens palette, which is such a fun, grungy sort of vibe. I absolutely love this palette as well. So all of the Ensley Rains will be staying. Okay, I think we all know that my Danessa Myricks palettes aren't going anywhere either. So we have my Groundwork palette, which I use every single day for my brows. And this is just such a perfect palette to have in your makeup collection. I really cannot rave about this palette enough. Then I have my Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 3 palette. This was my first Danessa Myricks palette. I am absolutely in love with this palette, and this made me fall in love with the Danessa Myricks formula. So keeping that. Then we have Volume 4, which is so fun and so beautiful. I love this palette as well. And then finally, her most recent Lightwork palette is the Volume 5, which looks like so, I'm like, ugh, the lighting is really hard to capture everything, but so pretty. All right, you guys, I think we all know that my Bella Beauté bar palettes are also not going anywhere. So I have the Angles of Illumination palette, which right now mine has 2 shades that I've popped out and are currently in a Z palette, but this is such a beautiful 16 pan all shimmer palette, especially if you are a blue lover. Then I have the Basic Witch palette, which was my first Bella Beauté bar eyeshadow palette, and I became quickly obsessed with the brand's formula. So I have been interested in pretty much everything they've released since. I haven't bought everything because they are more expensive, but I do really enjoy the brand. Then we have the Dead Roses palette, which was their Valentine's Day release or Valentine's collection palette this year. This is what this one looks like. Not my everyday color story, but excellent quality, and definitely going to be keeping this one around. And then most recently I picked up the Secret Garden palette, which is such a beautiful palette. It is a larger palette, but I'm so excited to continue to play around with this palette with all the colors, the greens. There's a row of neutrals, which I love. The shimmer shades the special shades, I'm especially excited to play around with. So this one's newest to my collection, definitely keeping all of these. Okay, I'm gonna try and break it up a little bit, and we're gonna toss in some palettes that I actually will be decluttering some from. So here's my stack of Colourpop palettes, and we can jump into all my 9 pans first. So I have the Colourpop Wild Child palette, which I actually do really love. This is a really beautiful, deeper, warm toned brown palette that you can definitely get some really sultry looks with. So I actually really enjoyed this one. I'm gonna keep that. I'm also going to keep Little Ray of Sunshine. There is something about this eyeshadow palette that just makes me happy. It is a 9 pan all matte palette, but I love the selection of shades in here, especially for the fall time. So I am gonna keep this. I am going to declutter my Colourpop The Child palette. Really cute palette, but I did No Pan Left Behind this. I completed it in that project, and I just wasn't as impressed with this palette as I have been in the past. It is getting older. I feel like the quality is declining a little bit. I thought about swapping out, or I thought about keeping a couple of the shades that I still really like. I actually really like these 2 shades at the bottom. But then I was like, you know what? I have enough eyeshadow palettes in my collection. I have enough shadows. I can just pass this along to someone who is gonna get more use out of it. Then I have the Colourpop Going Coconuts eyeshadow palette. I did swap out this center shade for a shade out of one of my other Colourpop palettes, and I am ready to part ways with this as well. I understand this is just a very basic neutral palette and could be really useful, but it's just not a palette I personally get excited to reach for. I would rather reach into my Natasha Denona I Need a Nude or my Natasha Denona Glam eyeshadow palette as opposed to reaching into this. Or even like my Tartelette in Bloom palette. So for me personally, I'm ready to also part ways with the Colourpop Going Coconuts palette. I'm also ready to part ways with the Tinkerbell palette. This one makes me sad because I love the packaging, similar to how I feel about the Colourpop Child palette, but I just don't love the shadows inside. I also completed this No Pan Left Behind, and I just was not impressed with the looks that I created. I felt like they were not kind of what I had envisioned when I went into this palette, and I do feel like the shades they look so beautiful in the pan, but it doesn't necessarily translate onto the eyes. So I don't want to keep this palette around to just have it sit around neglected. I would like to pass it along to someone who's going to get more use out of it. So this one I'm also getting rid of. Next up I have, are these all 12 pans? They're not all exactly the same size. Okay, so I have Colourpop Cabana, which I think I've thought about decluttering in the past, or did declutter, and then I recluttered this into my collection. Ooh, I don't know. I feel like I'm like, do I actually need this? I'm honestly not sure. What I was thinking about doing for this video was basically anything that's a maybe setting aside, and then doing a separate like chopping block No Pan Left Behind series for palettes that are maybes. And I think this might be a maybe for me. I like these 3 like neutral warm browns. I like the pop of blue, but what I've found with my Colourpop palettes as I've been working my way through them is as they've aged, the quality, especially in the shimmers, just really does start to decline. So I think I'm actually going to set this in the maybe pile. And then I will do a separate chopping block series, like I said, where I no pan left behind these palettes and then decide if they get to basically re-enter my collection or if I'm going to declutter those as well. So this is going to be a maybe. My Colourpop Cloud 9 eyeshadow palette, I am going to declutter. This is something that I purchased at the tail end of 2023, finished testing it kind of end of last year / beginning of this year, and I just was not impressed with this. I think the matte shadows are just a little bit, honestly, they pull more gray than I was wanting, even though they look kind of like, I don't know what I wanted from this palette. But I will say the shades I was most excited for, this shade right here as well as the shade right here, were just fine in my opinion, and I just am not excited about this palette. I was really underwhelmed with the quality, so I'm gonna pass along Colourpop Cloud 9. We know I'm gonna be keeping my Colourpop Limoncello palette. This is one of my favorite palettes in my collection and definitely my favorite from Colourpop. Beautiful color story. I love to travel with this. I think the quality on this one still performs really well, and I'm definitely going to be keeping this. I'm also going to be keeping my Colourpop Muppets palette. I also really love this palette. I think it's such a fun color story, and this was excellent Colourpop quality. Sometimes it's hit or miss on the type of quality you're getting with Colourpop palettes, but I really enjoyed my time with this palette, and I'm going to continue to use it in my collection. And then we have my Colourpop Getting Fresh palette. Now this is currently going in my regular No Pan Left Behind series, and so I think I'm going to move this along to the maybe, but as of right now, I'm kind of leaning towards, even just looking at it right now, I'm like, do I even want to work my way through using this No Pan Left Behind? I don't know. I feel like a part of me just like does want to declutter it, but then I like created a couple looks last year I really liked. Now granted, I could just depot some of the shades that I want to keep. I think I actually am gonna end up doing. I didn't, well maybe I'm just, oh no, I don't know what to do. So I'm like, okay, you know what, I'm gonna declutter this, but there's a few shades in here I will end up depotting to keep. I really like some of these like brighter bronzy golds. I was really underwhelmed with the like green shades. That's what I was most excited for in this palette. I was really underwhelmed with those shades, but I am gonna depot a couple of these shades, but declutter the palette as a whole. So this one is getting decluttered, and I will share that update in my next No Pan Left Behind update as well. All right, a couple more easy ones. I have my Adept collection, which I will be keeping all of my Adept palettes. So we have the Adept Heather Austin palette. We have the Adept Minka eyeshadow palette, stunning. We have my favorite Adept palette, which is the Ninhydrin eyeshadow palette. I absolutely love all the colors in here. And then we have Plain Jane Remastered, which honestly is not my most favorite palette, but I do love the Adept formula, and I also like that these shadows are magnetic, so I could pull these out and kind of use them to create a custom Z palette. There's just some shades in here that I just don't find myself reaching for. I'm not much of a red girly, but there are some shades that I really do love. Like I like these two shades, I love this shade, so I'm gonna keep the Plain Jane Remastered. It's just not my favorite from Adept. And then I have the Flying Fiddles palette, which I purchased this year, and I have really enjoyed this eyeshadow palette. A really fun twist on a neutral palette, and this I'm a big fan of. So this will be staying as well. And then I will also be keeping all of my What's Up Beauty palettes. So we have the Desert Monsoon palette. I've mentioned quite a few times recently that I feel like What's Up Beauty is one of the most underrated indie eyeshadow brands. I love their eyeshadow palettes. This is the Dragon's Eye palette, and then we also have the Geodes eyeshadow palette, which is also so beautiful. All right, this is what I have remaining for my Nabla collection. There was a point in time where Nabla was like my favorite brand for everything, and I purchased every single eyeshadow palette that they released, but I'm just not as into Nabla as I have been. I am gonna keep my Glorious Lights eyeshadow palette. This is a 4-pan like glitter quad, and I actually really like the Nabla glitter formula. It is like tacky-ish to the lids, and I don't have any other glitter palettes, so I'm gonna keep this. I have kept the Nabla Nude Cutie for quite a while just because I did really enjoy this palette at one point in time, and it's just not my absolute favorite anymore. I think it's really hard for me to part ways with all of my Nabla eyeshadows because I was such a big fan at one point in time. Ooh, I thought for sure I was gonna say that I was going to declutter this, and I'm like, ugh. I am. I have other palettes, other neutral palettes that I prefer over this one. So I actually am going to declutter the Cutie palette, the Nude Cutie. And then I think I'm also going to declutter the Read My Mind. I keep telling myself I need to No Pan Left Behind this and kind of decide how I feel about this, but then every time I try to do that, I just do not feel excited about this eyeshadow palette at all. So I'd rather just pass this along to someone in my family, a friend, someone who's gonna get use out of this, and that person just isn't me. So I am actually going to declutter the Nabla Read My Mind eyeshadow palette as well. All right, then we have my Natasha Denona mini palettes. So I'll lay them all out. Okay, so we have I Need a Nude, which we know I'm keeping. I love this palette so much, I literally repurchased it because my original was so destroyed. And I will also be keeping the mini retro palette. I love this palette, especially for the shade Galaxia right here. I am gonna also keep my mini pastel. I like this one. It's not a favorite, but it is a fun one, and I really like this shade on the end here. I don't love the Natasha Denona Mini Love palette, except for the like inner corner shade. I'm like, do I want to potentially just, should I maybe this one and No Pan? I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna maybe this one so that we can No Pan Left Behind, and I can see if I want to get rid of this or if I just want to like depot this shade to keep it. Okay, then I have the, is this the mini Biba? I have the mini Biba, which I also have the original Biba palette. And in theory, I should absolutely love this palette, but I feel like this always ends up pulling more peachy on me, even if I'm just reaching for like these two shades and this on the lid. And I just get really frustrated because I don't always want a peachy look. But then I feel like every time I wear this palette, I get compliments. So it's like such a toss-up. But I also have my Biba palette. And if I was gonna travel with a Natasha Denona mini, I always travel with the mini nude. Like, these are also like similar enough, but I'm also gonna always want to reach for mini nude over mini Biba. So I actually think I'm gonna declutter mini Biba. We're gonna say goodbye to mini Biba. And then we have the mini Starlit palette. This is what this one looks like. I did not realize when I bought this, and it's my own fault, I didn't realize that all of these shades were shades that you could find in other Natasha palettes. And I wasn't super impressed with this palette, but this is the shade Galaxia, which I love so much. So part of me is like, well, do I really want to declutter it? But I do still have a lot of Galaxia left here. And I guess I could always just re-buy Mini Retro if I went through Mini Retro, because I love this shade too. I actually think I'm going to declutter Mini Starlit as well. I don't need both. Okay, I'm decluttering Mini Starlit, meaning we are for sure decluttering 2, possibly 3, and then we are keeping 3 of my Natasha minis. Yay. Okay, you guys, it's a couple days later, so I have press-on nails now. The lighting might be better. I'm not sure. But I really want to get my apartment clean, and that means I need to finish this palette declutter. So, next up, we have the Too Faced Italian Spritz eyeshadow palette, which I will most definitely be keeping. This is probably my favorite Too Faced eyeshadow palette that they have ever come out with. I love the color story. I thought the quality was really nice, and I've had a lot of fun playing with this one. Then I have the Too Faced Natural Nudes palette. This is what this one looks like. I will also be keeping this. I like having this one around just for like a neutral palette that gives me a variety of neutrals. We have like true light neutrals, we have some dusty pinks here, and then we have some more warm tone browns at the end. Overall, just a really nice palette from Too Faced, so I will keep that. And I will also be keeping my Too Faced Pumpkin Spice palette. I think this is a really fun color story. I love a pumpkin spice latte. I love the fall, so also kind of keeping it for that. But I do like the palette overall. So we're going to keep all of my Too Faced palettes. Then we can move on to my Dose of Colors. I am going to be keeping my Sassy Siennas currently, but this is a product that I've said will self-destruct if I don't use it 20 times this year. So if I don't use this 20 times this year, this will be getting decluttered at the end of the year. Then I have my Baked Browns eyeshadow palette, which I will also be keeping. This was also a product I told you would self-destruct, but I have completed this shade right here completely in the palette. So this palette is saved, and I'm really happy to have this in my collection. I also feel like this pan right here has expanded quite a bit, and it's just a solid brown matte palette to have in my collection. And I will also be keeping my Dose of Colors Friendcation palette. I've had a couple of casualties in this palette now, and I don't believe I've ever dropped this palette. So this palette, or this shade right here, completely crumbled, and I had to kind of push it back in. And then this just like fell out. I was filming a video the other day, and I think that video will be going up after this video, and this shade just fell out, which was so sad. But I love this palette and I'm keeping it. We can go through my ABH palettes next. I'm gonna keep all of them. We have my ABH Jackie palette, which we know how much I love ABH Jackie. Then we have the ABH Cosmos palette, which I really loved. I know this palette was kind of hit or miss for people, but for me, I really enjoyed this eyeshadow palette, and I'm really happy to have this in my collection. And then finally, I have the ABH Nuevo palette, which I also think is a really fun and beautiful color story. So this one will also be staying. Okay, zoomed you guys in a little bit and turned my brightness down a bit, just trying to get the best lighting here. These are my Unearthly palettes. I will definitely be keeping the Sorcerer's Smoke palette. This is such a beautiful neutral palette with some greens and just some fun pops. Then we have the Fall Magic palette, which is a very, very beautiful palette as well. I love all of the special shades in this palette, and Unearthly just makes a really great formula. Then I have the Alien Cosmetics Not Normal eyeshadow palette, and I think I'm going to put this palette into my palette chopping block. I think even if I do decide to declutter this eyeshadow palette, I will just like retire it and not use it anymore, but maybe like display this palette somewhere on my shelves, just because I really love the artwork of this eyeshadow palette. This is the color story of this one, and this is just not a palette I find myself gravitating towards. It's not a color story I get excited to reach for, and I would really love to no pan left behind this. So I'm going to put this in my palette chopping block, and we will decide what will happen with this palette after I have no pan left behind it. Next up, I have all of my Kados palettes, and I actually think this is gonna be really difficult. So we can start with the easy choices. I know I'm gonna keep my Flower Punk palette. This is what the Flower Punk palette looks like. I absolutely love this palette. The mint shades aren't my favorite, but the rest of the palette I am so in love with. So this is definitely staying. Then I know I'm also most definitely keeping my Sashimi City eyeshadow palette. This is what this one looks like. I also love this palette. It's one of my favorite palettes in my entire collection. So this one is staying. These two I feel like are consistently on my chopping block in my head. And I think I struggle to declutter these because I think the packaging is so unique and the quality is really good. I just do not find myself gravitating towards these color stories. Now this palette right here, the Lunar Lavender, is currently in one of my project pans, and I need a no pan left behind this. So I'm actually gonna put this one also in the chopping block. And then we have the Astro Pink palette, which looks like this. This is not a color story. This isn't a color story I feel inclined to reach for, and I think the reason I've kept this around is because I tell myself, well, there's two neutral browns at the end here, so I should think of this as a usable palette. But I guess I just, like, this does not motivate or inspire me to use this. It's just not a color story that's for me, I don't think. So I actually wasn't planning to do this at the beginning of this video, but I think I am going to be decluttering the Astro Pink. So I'm going to set that in the declutter pile. Then I have the Escape Pod. I absolutely love this palette, and this is a palette that really did make me want to play around with color more, so this just holds a fond place in my heart. I also really love the selection of shimmers in this palette. I like the greens. I love the shade Soiree. I think it's a really beautiful inner corner highlight. I really love this purple, and I love this like periwinkle purple and this cobalt blue, so I will be keeping the Escape Pod. And then we have Club Nebula, which I do really love this eyeshadow palette, and there are a few specific shades in this palette that I really do keep this palette around for, I think. I love the shade Gravity. I love the shade Nebula. I like the shade Celestial. The mattes are just a little bit deeper than I typically am reaching for. Oh, this is so tough. I feel like my favorite shades in this palette really is, I do really like this row right here, and I love the shade Astro. I think the shade Astro is so beautiful, and Gravity is a really unique shade in my collection. But this is a bulkier palette, and I just don't find myself reaching for this one all that frequently. I really, really love Angie's collaborations with Odin's Eye, so I think maybe I am ready to pass along the Club Nebula palette. I feel like I'm gonna feel regret for that, but also I'm like, I'm gonna see if my sister wants this one. So it can stay in the family, but it's not taking up as much space in my collection. I also just love the packaging of this. Like, yes, it's bulkier, but I love, like, the artwork on the front is just so beautiful. Plus, it was Angie's first collab, so I'm like, I'm gonna see if my sister wants this one. I think that's what we're gonna do. I'll declutter it from my collection and pass it along to hers. All right, you guys, next up I have just a bunch of, like, palettes from brands I only own, like, one from. So we can start with this one right here. This is from It's Belle Cosmetics, and actually I do have a second palette from It's Belle. I just haven't gotten around to testing it. This is the Flare palette. It is a 9-pan all shimmer palette, but I actually really, really love all of the shades in this palette, so I'm gonna keep that. Then I have the Terra Moon's Space Chemistry palette. I did purchase this palette this year. It is not my favorite palette in my entire collection. I was not impressed with the matte formula, and I think that there's something to be desired with these shimmers in terms of longevity. I don't feel like they stay on my eyes all day, but it's still a really fun palette to have in my collection. I also purchased it this year, so I'm looking to rank these both midway through the year and at the end of the year. So I'm gonna keep this. I think we also know I will most definitely be keeping my Tartelette in Bloom palette. I decluttered my old palette, my old Tartelette in Bloom, because it was so old, and then I repurchased another Tartelette in Bloom because it's just such a staple palette to have, at least for me in my collection. It's not the best palette, not the best quality on the market, but I just love this palette, so that's staying. Then I have my Dominique Cosmetics Latte palette. Looks like this. I have completed this palette, No Pan Left Behind, and it is just not a favorite palette in my collection anymore. I used to really love this, and I still think it's a beautiful palette, and someone who maybe doesn't have as large of a palette collection would love this palette and get so much use out of it. But because I have so many palettes in my collection, I really do like to cycle and rotate through my palette collection. I've got these shades and other palettes that I prefer reaching for over the Dominique Cosmetics Latte palette, so I am going to be decluttering this one. I also am decluttering my Juvia's The Pinks palette. Now I have already gone ahead and depotted 3 of the shades into little, oh my gosh, magnetic pans, because I really enjoyed these 3 shades and felt like they were unique to my collection. The other 3 remaining are just not shades that I personally find myself gravitating towards. So I'm decluttering this palette, but I did save a few of those shades. Most definitely keeping my Tiny Marvels palette in collaboration with Mel and Sydney Grace. I absolutely love this palette. I've been working my way through this eyeshadow palette, No Pan Left Behind style, and it reminded me of just how much I love this palette, so this is staying. I'm also going to be keeping my Fantasy Cosmetica Druid palette. I love this palette, and I'm definitely interested in picking up more palettes from Fantasy Cosmetica. I just haven't done it yet. I swear every palette they launch, I'm like, ooh, that looks so pretty. Ooh, that looks so pretty. I would be so happy to have every palette that they have, or that they've come out with, but as of right now, I just have the Druid palette, and I will be keeping this. I am ready to part ways with the last remaining BH Cosmetics palette in my collection. This is the 90s Dance Remix. This is what this looks like. It's a fine palette, and I really enjoyed this palette when I first got it, but I just feel like the quality is not what it used to be. And I also have these shades in, like, specifically my Glamlite Ice Cream Dream palette is pretty similar, or I can get like a similar vibe with that palette. So I'm ready to pass this one along. And then I will also be passing along my Moira Fun is in the Air eyeshadow palette. This is what this one looks like. It's pretty, but definitely not my favorite color story, not my favorite quality. I really feel like I was keeping this through my last declutter just because I really like the shade, this like lime not lime green, neon yellow, cobalt blue, and the orange. But I have purchased the Blend Bunny Surge palette, and I can get better quality shadows in pretty much the same shades. So Moira Fun is in the air. We'll also be getting the boot. All right, next up I have all of my Melt palettes. Going into this, I'm like, I think I'm gonna keep them all. Okay, so we have the Bad Side Zodiac Earth palette. I am a Taurus, I'm an Earth sign. So I purchased it for that reason, but I actually really love this color story. I think the matte shades, or the selection of mattes, is really fun. It kind of is giving subculture vibes. And then I really like, this is like such a fun yellow gold, not my typical like reach, but I think it's beautiful. And I also really love this like bronzy kind of satin taupey sort of shade. I think it's really pretty. I was actually really impressed with this palette, so this one is staying. I'm also going to be keeping Melt Smoke Sessions. I absolutely love this palette if I'm wanting just a very intense green shimmer on the lids. Plus this is my first Melt palette and I love the outer packaging. I think it's such a fun one, so that one's staying. Oh, then I have my Melt Smoke Sessions eyeshadow palette. Am I ready to part ways with this? I didn't think I was. Like when I pulled out my palettes, you know when you pull your palettes out, you're starting to prep for a declutter and you kind of know like what you're gonna be getting rid of versus what you're not. I definitely thought I would be keeping this, but I'm like, maybe I am finally ready to part ways with Melt Smoke Sessions. I feel like the only time I reached for it is when I was testing it at first, and then it got rolled into No Pan Left Behind. And I always say this is a really frustrating formula to work with. It ends up all over my face. I really don't see myself reaching for this unless it gets pulled into a project. And I feel like I can get pretty much the same vibe from this that I can if I mix, even if I have to mix and match a few other palettes in my collection. I think I'm actually ready to get rid of Melt Smoke Sessions. Okay, we're decluttering, and I don't even think I feel regret towards that. Okay, that's great. Then I have the Melt Gemini palette. This is what this one looks like. I do find Melt's formula to be a little bit more finicky to work with. Like I feel like I have to take more time when using Melt palettes, which is why I don't feel like I reach for them on a very frequent basis. But I am gonna keep the Melt Gemini palette. I think it's a beautiful color story, a very fun grungy one for the fall time. So I'm gonna keep that. And then I have the Rust palette, which looks like this. Okay, I wasn't thinking I was going to be decluttering the Rust palette either. But looking into this, I'm like, do I actually need this? Probably not. Like, honestly, probably not. I'm looking at this and I'm like, with the exception of like this shade right here, which honestly, I feel like I have something very similar. It's different, but I also just am not reaching for that type of yellow that frequently. I actually think I'm gonna declutter Melt Rust as well. I'm like, okay, Gemini has, this is like a little bit more yellow than Gemini, but like, I'm ready to declutter. Okay, I'm shocked. I was not planning to declutter any of my Melt palettes, but I'm ready to declutter Rust as well. Wow, I'm shocking myself. Okay, this feels good. Okay, now that I've actually decluttered some things, I feel like I can share another stack of palettes I know I'm not decluttering. So these are 5 palettes in my collection that I haven't gotten around to testing yet. They're new, so obviously I'm not gonna be decluttering them. Up first, we have the MAC Encrypted Kryptonite palette. I really wanna get around to testing this very shortly before my next palette ranking goes up. I feel like this would be an easy palette to just bust through that and kind of see what I think. Then I have the It's Belle Cosmetics Under the Full Moon. How freaking beautiful is this palette? I love a blue eyeshadow. I've really fallen in love with blues, so I'm very, very excited to play around with this palette. I'm kind of sad that I haven't gotten around to it yet, but that one obviously will be staying. Then I have the Dive Room Cosmetics Dewdrops palette. How freaking beautiful is this little 6-pan all shimmer palette? Like the shade Drip, that yellow, oh my goodness, I'm so excited to play around with that. I'm excited for the shade Splash, this really beautiful kind of marbled shade. Blish looks like a really beautiful kind of like white based blue. There's a blue, I'm excited. We're playing with this soon. I'm a little embarrassed I have not gotten around to the Resurgence palette. I've used a couple of shades from this already, but it's embarrassing that I have not yet finished my testing process with the Resurgence palette from Unearthly in collaboration with Heather Austin. So we need to get around to that. And then I also have the Glamlite Kiss palette. Why was I so excited to buy this? And then I got it and I was like, this is actually like so dark and deep. Like there's really not any light shades except for like this shade right here. But I think I saw swatches of like the greens and I was very into the greens and the blues. I haven't used this at all yet, so we need to get around to testing this as well. All right, you guys, I have a lot of indie palettes coming up, and for the most part, I feel pretty attached to a lot of my indie eyeshadows. So I don't know that there's gonna be a lot more that I'm decluttering, but you never know. I surprised myself with the melt ones, so we'll see what happens. I will definitely be keeping my Sugar Pill Fun Size palette. I love this little 9-pan all matte colorful palette. That one's definitely staying. I'm also keeping my Menagerie Killer Purr palette. This is what this one looks like. I did have one casualty in this palette. It was my own fault. I dropped this. Also, I dropped it, and these are magnetic pans, so they all kind of, can you tell? I even broke a mirror. 7 years of bad luck. I broke this within the last year, and I already felt like I had a couple of years of bad luck, so can we just like tack those on to the 7 that are to come? My pans fell out, so this might not look exactly like the layout. I didn't look up the layout to put the pans back in, but the shimmer shades in this palette are so beautiful. I really, really enjoyed this palette. And I'm also going to keep my pastel palette from them. It's not my most used palette in my collection, but it is a fun pastel palette to have around. Then I have, oh, I have 2 Lethal palettes. I'm going to grab my other Lethal. All right, I have the Midnight Serenade palette from Lethal. Purchased this one this year, so this is one that will get ranked in the ranking palette videos for this year. Definitely keeping, although I will say I was not as impressed with the wear time on these shadows as I expected to be. I think that the shimmers are so stunning and so beautiful, but they just tended to like fade and crease throughout the day, so that was a little bit disappointing. Nevertheless, we'll be keeping, and we'll also be keeping my, is this the Wildflower? I think, yeah, I think this is the Wildflower palette. This is what this one looks like. This is an absolutely stunning palette. I have so much fun with this palette every single time that I play with it, so definitely keeping this. Also going to be keeping my Cosmic Brushes Muse eyeshadow palette. This is something that I purchased either at the very end of last year or the very beginning of this year, but I started testing it this year, so this is something that will get ranked this year. And I am so impressed with this palette. I do plan to pick up more palettes from Cosmic Brushes in the future. I was waiting to see if they have a release before purchasing, just because if I'm remembering correctly, the shipping was pretty expensive, so I'd rather just like purchase a bulk of their palettes at once. But this is a beautiful color story. I really love this shade Antique at the bottom, as well as Ambient up here. The green shimmers and the mattes were so easy to work with, so highly recommend this palette, and that one's definitely staying. I have a couple more palettes that I just own one from the brand. We know I'm keeping my Persona Identity 1 palette. Mine looks a little beat up. We had a casualty here. I absolutely love and adore this eyeshadow palette. In fact, it's like if I had to choose to do like a sultry smoky look, I'm gonna go with this palette 10 times out of 10 over the Melt Mary Jane palette. So that just makes me feel even better about decluttering Melt Mary Jane. Not that they have the same color story, but I'm like, these shades like Gold Digger and Seductive are like the vibe of like what I'm wanting for Melt Mary Jane. Melt Mary Jane is like definitely more intense and like glitter metallic, but then you have glitter falling out throughout your whole face. So keeping Persona Identity, and also keeping my Viseart Soleil Le Plug. I absolutely love this eyeshadow palette, and I definitely want to try more from Viseart. I just haven't gotten around to, you know, picking a palette to do so, but love this color story, love the formula. Definitely keeping. All right, next up we have my stack of Glaminatrix Cosmetics palettes, and I'm a huge fan of Glaminatrix. Their formula, their quality, I think is excellent. So I don't think I'm gonna get rid of any of their palettes. First up, I have the Fairy Lights palette. This is an all shimmer 6-pan, very metallic palette. Really fun to just have in your arsenal to kind of mix and match with other looks if you're just wanting to add like a big pop of like a sparkly, intense metallic shimmer. So keeping that. I also have the Rich Romantic eyeshadow palette, which looks like this. I actually wasn't planning on picking this up, and then I saw swatches and I had to. I'm so impressed. Ignore the green paint on my finger. so impressed with the like special shades that Glaminatrix does. They are the most smooth feeling on the finger. I have never felt a formula quite like it. They're so shifty, so pretty. I cannot recommend Glamlite enough. So keeping that. Then I have the Sugar and Spice eyeshadow palette, which I have popped in a couple of shades out of some of my Colourpop palettes because I wasn't a big fan of the color story, specifically with the mattes in this palette, and the Colourpop shades fit right in. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna pop in whatever I want. These pans are magnetic. Really big fan though, again, of the special shades in this palette. I think they're really fun. It's not my favorite color story of all time, but again, I really love the quality. I love the outer packaging. I think is so cute, is so pretty. So I'm keeping that. Then I have my Nocturnal palette, which I think is such a fun color story, specifically for spooky season. This shade actually right here is kind of reminding me of the shade out of the Club Nebula palette. Let me actually compare. All right, Club Nebula and Glamlite, they look very similar, and I actually swatched them out too. So here is Club Nebula, here is Glamlite. There is a slight difference in undertone. Like potentially the Glamlite has a little bit more yellow in it, but very, very, very similar. So maybe I still feel even better about passing Club Nebula along to the sis. I am going to be keeping this palette. I think it's really beautiful. I will say I struggled a little bit with some of the mattes, but I, again, love the quality of the special shades. The shade Night Vision, this green is so beautiful. I also love Luna, Milky Way. So, so pretty. Keeping that. And then I've said so many times on my channel that the Nearly Natural palette is like one of my top favorite palettes in my entire collection. So obviously keeping that. All right, next up I have my stack of Glamlite palettes. And for the most part, I really love the Glamlite formula. Up first though, I have the Scooby-Doo Retro Reggae palette, and I did depot this green shade right here into a magnetic pan because this green was such a special, unique green to my collection. I freaking loved it. But the rest of the palette, I really struggled with this quad of shades over here, and I've no pan left behind in this palette twice now, and I just am ready to pass this one along. So I will be decluttering the Scooby-Doo Retro Reggae palette. Then I have the Chocolate Martini palette. I really love this palette. This is such a solid, kind of neutral palette with a bit of a twist. On camera sometimes, or even in pictures, it doesn't look like it has the variety or the depth and dimension that really does come through. I really love this like golden copper shade, and there is just a variety of undertones amongst the mattes. I have created some looks I really love with this palette, so this one I'm keeping. I'm also keeping the Glamlite Cake. I'm currently trying to work my way through, no pan left behinding this palette, and it's been a struggle. I have not reached for this once this year, but I don't have a palette quite like this in my collection with this variety of colors, and the quality is excellent. So I will be keeping this. I will also be keeping my Ice Cream Dream palette from Glamlite. I love this palette. It is my favorite palette, I believe, from Glamlite. The matte formula, I mean, every single matte, no matter the color, no matter the shade in this palette, performs so beautifully on the eyes. The metallics, specifically in this row, I really love using as nail polish and on the eyes. They're absolutely beautiful. It's such a fun color story to have in my collection. Again, I really don't have all of these tones or shades throughout my collection, so it is pretty unique to my collection, and I will be keeping this one. And then I have my Scooby-Doo 2 palette, which I love, love, love the outer packaging. And while not every shade in this palette is my absolute favorite, I am going to keep this palette. I really do love this row of metallics as well as the other metallics scattered throughout. And I do love some of the matte shades. Like, I like that I have the cobalt blue. I do like this dark green up here. And I got to keep at least one Scooby palette. So this one will be staying. Okay, we can move on to my Aether Beauty palettes next. I have 2 quads and 2 larger palettes. So let's start with the easy ones. I know I'm going to be keeping the Summer Solstice palette. I actually had thought I was going to declutter this, and then I gave it a second try through No Pan Left Behinding this palette, and I really enjoyed it. Aether Beauty is also coming back, and I'm very excited to see what they come back with. I am also going to keep my Amartine quad. It is just a little mauve, like dusty purple quad. But if I'm looking for just an easy dusty purple look, this palette always has my back. I always love the way that my look turns out when I use this little quad. So I'm gonna keep that. I do think I'm going to declutter the Rose Quartz Crystal Quad. This is what this one looks like. It is really, really beautiful, but I definitely prefer the Amartine Quad, and I just don't get as excited about like the one look I can create. I know I can create more than one look with this, but the limited looks I can create with this palette, I don't get as excited as I do the Amartine Crystal Quad. So this one I'm ready to part ways with. And this one I just, I don't know about this one. My sister ended up giving me this one. It is the Rose Quartz Crystal Gemstone Palette. Maybe I need to no pan left behind this one. Maybe I put this one in my palette purgatory chopping block situation and work my way through this to make a decision. I think that's what we need to do with this one. So this one is moving to the chopping block pile. We're not sure about this one yet. All right, a couple more indie palettes. I have my 2 Nomad palettes. I have the Okavango Safari palette. Just a really, really fun color story on this one. I will say I am not the biggest fan of the Nomad Cosmetics formula. I definitely think there is something to be desired. There is room for improvement. I think that some of their shadows are just pressed extremely firmly, and I really struggle with some of them, but I really enjoyed some of the looks that I created with this palette. I think it's such a fun, like, I love a leopard print, so the outer packaging really gets to me, and I am gonna keep that. As well as the Ghost Town palette. Again, love the outer packaging. Nomad Cosmetics really like nails it with attention to detail in their packaging. So I'm like, could they just put a little bit more into some of their formulas? This is what this palette looks like. This is a very beautiful color story. Really fun palette. The only shades I really struggled with in this palette was this row right here. I will say this is the most recent palette I personally own from Nomad, and it is definitely a notch up in terms of quality. So I haven't tried some of their palettes after this one. Maybe their quality has improved even more, but I'm a huge, huge fan of this palette. I think it's beautiful, and I'm definitely keeping this. Okay, I have my Sigma Corta Rosa palette, which I'm definitely keeping. I recently finished this palette, No Pan Left Behind, and reminded myself just how much I love this palette. So this is definitely staying. And I will also be keeping my Clarity Cosmetics So More Amazing palette. Although, should I put this in the chopping block? No. I'm going to keep this one. I really do love the 5 shimmers in this palette. I recently panned the shade Don't Be Shellfish. I just want to make sure I complete this No Pan Left Behind before the end of summer, because I haven't done that with this palette yet, and I would love to know my thoughts after using it in that way. But as of right now, So More Amazing will be staying. I am also going to be keeping these 2 Alter Ego palettes. I have the Canyon palette right here, and then I have the Artemis palette right here. These are the 2 palettes from Alter Ego I personally have felt like keeping. I also have the new Mystique palette, which I haven't gotten around to testing, but typically if Alter Ego sends me a palette that is a dupe for a palette I already own in my collection, I set it aside for my mom or my sister just because I always kind of like the real thing. But I think Alter Ego makes an excellent formula. I am currently in the process of No Pan Left Behinding this palette and really, really enjoying my time with this. And I also just love the color story of the Alter Ego Artemis. I wish that all of their palettes would be like this heavy, bulky material. I really love the Artemis palette, but keeping both of those. I have my Artist Couture palettes. I know I'm keeping Supreme Nudes. I absolutely love this palette. It's one of my favorites in my entire collection. But Supreme Bronze, I've like been kind of like hemming and hawing about. This is one I'm not 100% certain of. That is what Supreme Bronze looks like. I loved this palette when this launched. I really, really did. And I'm like, the shade Toasty, this one right here, Soleil, and Baked are really what's like making me want to keep this palette. Okay, I just wanted to like swatch. I don't know if you can even see. I wanted to swatch Soleil. It's not coming. It's more gold swatched than it is yellow. If it was yellow, I would probably struggle. If it was like a true yellow, I'd probably struggle a little bit more. I think I'm going to declutter this one. Oh, this one is tough though. It is really tough because I'm like, Toasty and Baked are like excellent shadows. Oh, it's so tough. Do I need to? I'm gonna put this in my chopping block. That's what I'm gonna do. This one's going to the chopping block pile. Then I have, okay, you guys, I have the Lawless. I have Lawless, the Glam one. This is what this looks like. I recently No Pan Left Behind this palette, and I was saying that I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to keep this one after No Pan Left Behind. I was thinking I was gonna keep it, but I actually think I'm going to declutter this palette. I feel like I have the shades in this palette that I feel like I have these matte shades in my Natasha Denona collection, and then these two shades right here I do really like, and I think they're really beautiful, but I also feel like I have indie shadows that I would rather use over these two, so I'd rather just pass this one along. I feel like my sister would love this palette. I'm gonna declutter this one. Then I have some more indie palettes I definitely won't be parting ways with. I have the Diva Room Cosmetics Moth and Moon palette, which I am still working my way through. I haven't even completed this palette. I am so impressed though with this top row of special shades. They are they're absolutely incredible. And then I'm also keeping the Gloomy Gardens palette. I purchased this year. I really enjoy this palette. It's also something I will rank in all of my ranking palettes this year, so keeping that. And then also keeping Blend Bunny Surge. I haven't even finished testing every single shade in this palette, but I've really had so much fun with this one. I'm actually so impressed with the Blend Bunny Cosmetics matte formula. I feel like sometimes, because I feel like indie does like special shades so well, I don't think that they're gonna do mattes as well, but I have been so impressed with the mattes from Blend Bunny, so keeping this. Okay, we are on to the last little bit here. We have the Urban Decay Stoned Vibes palette, which I have really been enjoying traveling with this palette lately. I've gone to Vegas twice in the last year, and this has come with me both times and gotten quite a bit of use while I'm there. So definitely keeping that. And I'm also going to keep my Naked Honey eyeshadow palette. I really, really like this color story. I think this is a great one to have in my collection. It's not my favorite palette of all time, but I do really enjoy that. Then I have my little LH Cosmetics Shimmer Saga quad. I really love having this. Again, a 4-pan all shimmer quad. Good to have from time to time if I'm wanting to just jazz up a look. So I'm gonna keep that. Then I have my stack of Huda minis. So I have the Huda Nude Medium. I do really love this color story. Keeping that, great quality. I have the Nude Rich, which I had decluttered, and then I recluttered this into my collection. I really love the shimmers in this palette. I don't so much feel like I need like the mattes in this palette, but I do really love the shimmers, so I am gonna keep this one for the time being. Then I have the Wild Jaguar, which I really enjoy. I think this is such a fun one. I will also be keeping Wild Python, which looks like this. I will also be keeping Wild Tiger. I did have a casualty in this palette, but I especially love this shade. I talk about that shade quite a bit. And then I'm also keeping my Neon Orange. I don't have a palette like this at all in my collection. I have had comments that I think there's shades in here that aren't necessarily safe for the eyes. I've never had an issue with any of the shades personally, and I really like the color story. All right, and then we can end. I think we're ending with my NARS palette. So I have the NARS Suede quad here, which I wanted this for traveling, and I'm gonna keep this. I really like NARS, and this is a nice little just 6-pan palette to have. We have NARS Summer Solstice, which is my absolute favorite palette of all time, but it looks really, really similar to NARS Orgasm. This is NARS Orgasm. And I'm just thinking, like, I definitely prefer this NARS Summer Solstice to NARS Orgasm. Do I need both? I don't feel like I need both. I told you guys, like, I feel like I've said before, like, I'm buying every single NARS palette, but I did talk myself out of one of the recent ones, not the checkered one, but there's another one that came out right before this. I talked myself out of that because I was like, I'm not going to reach for that pink color story. And now I'm looking at these and I'm like, I feel like I do not need both of these, and I definitely prefer Summer Solstice because I love this lid topper shade and that lid topper shade. I think I'm going to declutter NARS Orgasm Rising and just keep Summer Solstice. And then I think I'm keeping everything else. So I have NARS Climax, which I will be keeping. I have this one, which I do like, but I'm like, do I need it? Do I? This is the Stargaze palette. I love these 3 shades. Yeah, I'm gonna keep this one. I'm gonna keep it. I don't want to declutter that one, just to like have an extra declutter. Then I have this one. I purchased this one this year. I probably didn't need this one. but I am like, I'm wanting to keep this one around to like rank it and things like that. It's not like bad, it's just like, I feel like this is a regurgitated color story, but I do also like the checkered. We know I like checkered things, so I do love that. I'm keeping that. And then I have the Summer Unrated palette, which looks like this. I will also be keeping this one. This may be a repeat, but I feel like since I've filmed 2 days, across 2 days, I'm like, did I talk about my Patrick Ta Major Dimensions? I have Major Dimension 1, which I will be keeping, as well as Major Dimension 2, which I also will be keeping. I haven't had the issues in my Major Dimension 2 as some people have, and I really like the quality of both. So those two are both staying, and then I will also share my Kasha stacks with you guys. Oh boy. Okay, so we have Cold Brew, which is one of the most recent stacks. Keeping. I also have Bubble Tea, which also came out with Cold Brew, and it's a really fun purple stack. I have Neutral Moment. They sent over a really generous PR package with a bunch of these. Neutral Moment I've been reaching for a ton. It's an all matte trio, and I really like that. Chocolate Dahlia is one that I personally purchased for myself and have owned for a while. A really good neutral one to have in my collection, so keeping that. Forest Night I really like. This is a really fun kind of neutral trio. I really like the, oh, we had a little sprinkle out there. I really like the top shade in this one because it is a little bit more of that like chunky, sticky, very metallic texture. Okay, then I have Glowing Guava, and I'm like, do I need Glowing Guava? I feel like I've decluttered and recluttered Glowing Guava. This is just really not a color story I feel that drawn to. And I feel like I recluttered this into my collection because I was loving the stacks and kind of wanted to like have all of the stacks, but now I'm like, I don't need all of the stacks, but I want the stacks that work well for me. I think I'm going to declutter Glowing Guava. Then I have, this one is Mauve Bouquet. Okay, I did pull this one out. I had decluttered this one in the past, and then I pulled this one back out because I do really like this for like a mauve moment, and it has one of those really beautiful, again, chunkier, glitterier like textures on the top. So I'm gonna keep that. Also gonna keep Peach, is it Marmalade? Peach Madeline. Love this stack for a peach moment. And then also we'll be keeping Coral Sunrise, again, a fun peach moment one. I actually had this and then dropped mine and it broke, and so I pulled this one back out of the PR package that they sent. I really love this one. And then there's two others that they sent in the stack that I didn't own. One is in Rosewater. Let's see what this one looks like. Ooh, that top shade looks extremely pretty. Ooh, another sparkly shade. Okay, that also looks so ethereal and pretty. Is this also a sparkly? Okay, yes, also a sparkly. Okay, I think I am gonna keep Rosewater, and then I have Velvet Dream here, which looks like another one that I will keep. So maybe I'm only decluttering one stack. All right, so we have Velvet Dream has kind of like a lid setting shade, but maybe like a little bit deeper on top. Is this an all matte stack? This looks like a really beautiful all matte stack though. Okay, yes, an all matte stack, but this looks like a very useful warm toned all matte stack. So I'm gonna keep this, meaning I'm keeping 10 stacks and decluttering just the one Glowing Guava. All right, you guys, so after all of that, these are all of the palettes that I will be decluttering. There are a total of 23. I thought it was gonna be more. There's a total of 23 palettes here that I am gonna be decluttering. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 palettes that are going on the chopping block. So a potential of 6 more palettes that will be decluttered. I will post at the bottom of the screen, just because I didn't take account at the beginning of this, how many palettes I kept versus decluttered versus on chopping block. I know it wasn't the biggest declutter, but I always like to go through my palette collection every 6 months or so. I feel like I do really love eyeshadow palettes, buying and trying new eyeshadow palettes, but I feel like when my palette collection gets to be over like 150, and even 150 feels like a lot, and I know some of you are like, girl, that is literally so many, you crazy. But when it gets to be over like, honestly, anywhere between like 125 and 150, it just starts to feel too overwhelming and like I have too many choices. So I like to declutter every 6 months or so, even if it's not the most cutthroat declutter just to like whittle things down. So I'm feeling good about the palettes that I did declutter. I surprised myself with a few of them. More to come on my chopping block palettes, but that is going to wrap it up for today's palette collection and declutter video. I would love to know if you've recently decluttered any palettes from your collection. If so, what are you getting rid of? Let a girl know in the comments below. Other than that, thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.